Welcome back to the Scribbler podcast, where we explore the stories, policies, and politics shaping our world. This is Taji Terrell, host of today's podcast. Recently, over 1,500 international students had their visas suddenly revoked without any warning to their universities. The move caused confusion and panic, leaving students unsure of what was happening or why. After a wave of legal action from institutions across the country, ICE eventually reinstated the visas. But the damage was done, and it's raised big questions. What does this mean for the students who were affected? And how might this impact international enrollment and trust in the US higher education system going forward? Joining me is my co host, Bertram de Souza. Our guests today are two leaders in international education, Nate Myers, an associate professor in teacher education and leadership studies, and the former director of the international office at Youngstown State University, and Jef Davis, also a former director of the international office at BISU. Jef is currently the principal designated school official and responsible officer at Kent State University. He's also the author of many publications, one of which is titled Intercultural Sensitivity in Foreign Student Advising. Both Jef and Nate have been on the front lines of supporting international students. We'll unpack what's happening, what international students should watch for, and how universities may be impacted by these recent developments. So again, welcome, Nate and Jef. It was so good to see you, Jef, after so many years. Can you each tell us a little bit about your background and also your involvement with international students? Jef, do you want to start?
Sure. So I work with international students primarily in supporting them in navigating the complexities of the immigration restrictions placed on student visa holders. I work at Kent State University currently, and where I'm the principal designated school official. So I have obligations for monitoring compliance as well as helping students, as I said, navigate things like getting permission for accepting employment for an internship or post-completion work authorization that is an extension of the student status. And I've been in this field for, this is going on 40 years. So I've been working in various ways supporting international students.
Nate?
Thanks, Taji. Jef is twice as knowledgeable as I am because I've only been in this field going on 20 years now. But no, I'm currently teaching at Youngstown State. I'm consulting for various universities and trying to help them build an international enrollment and streamline some of their processes to make their campus more friendly and accessible to international students. For 9 years, I was a senior international officer at Youngstown State, where we built a significant international footprint. Grew from about 180 to about 1,000 over the course, enrolled over the course of 9 years. And during that time, I served as a DSO, designated school official, a backup advisor, really, to international students. And, I feel very strongly that in addition to our legal responsibilities of, helping students maintain their F1 status, it's also incumbent upon universities, American universities, to create, I call it a home base, that sense of home, that sense of identification, because, unlike our local students, if they're having a tough day, if something goes wrong, it's very much more difficult for them to pick up the phone and call mom, or certainly to run home and talk with their brother, or, have that shoulder to rely on. And so in various universities, wherever I've been, I've tried to really emphasize the role of the international office in providing that kind of social support, home base.
Nate and Jeff, I was going to start with another question, but now that you mentioned your role working with international students, let me read part of the policy statement from Youngstown State University's International Programs Office. Quote, "Remember that it is the student's responsibility to be informed about immigration rules and any rule changes which occur during their stay in the U.S. The International Programs Office provides international students at YSU with the necessary information to do this, but it is the student and not the university who is ultimately responsible for abiding by rules and maintaining legal student status. I mean, it almost seems as though YSU and I presume other institutions of higher learning are basically saying to these international students, you know, you're on your own, basically. If you need help, call, and I hate to say this, there are a lot of students who don't know how to maneuver through the immigration system, who don't know who to call. There's a language issue as well. There are not everybody is fortunate enough to be able to speak, English as clearly and articulate well. So what's going on here? Is this something that you're familiar with? Is this a policy statement that makes sense to you? Nate, go ahead, and then Jeff can weigh in.
I mean, Jeff and I can kind of go back and forth on this. I think that every university will have some variation of that type of statement because, as you said, Bertram, according to the CFR, it is the student's responsibility to maintain their own status. I can't maintain a student's status for them, right? However, you change more minds with sunshine than wind,
right?
And so, obviously, I would very much emphasize the role of the International Student Office there to help the student and to provide them with wise counsel and to say, hey, we're the experts. We got this. In case you have any questions, just walk through the door. And if we don't have the answers immediately, we'll get them.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think it's in one sense, when you don't interact with college students every day, it's easy to think, well, we should just create structures that have such rigid guardrails that students can't inadvertently violate immigration regulations. But they are adults. They can drop classes. They can choose not to enroll in violation of the student visa. They can accept a job for an employer who's either unscrupulous or uninformed themselves without us being able to, intervene. So they do have to have some responsibility for checking on things. And I get many, many questions that are from overly cautious students. Is it okay if I volunteer at an animal shelter, or if I do something that, would possibly, in their minds, violate some restrictions on them? And I'd much rather have them come in with questions about things that they are allowed to do. There's no regulation that says you can volunteer at a shelter, but there's no regulation that says you may go shopping at Walmart. You don't need a regulation for everything you're allowed to do. There are restrictions on certain activities, and we work very hard to keep them informed. And if students don't read and don't ask, it really, is beyond our capacity to prevent them from making bad decisions all the time. They're young people. I have 3 college students myself in my family, and believe me, parents and administrators are not going to prevent college students from sometimes making poor choices.
I mean, as an international student, I feel like we were often overly cautious about everything. We didn't want to do anything wrong because this is a country you don't know about. You don't want to do something wrong without realizing it. And I know there are certain rules about working. International students are not allowed to work outside campus, or if they work on campus, there are certain limitations on how many hours. So those are mostly known by most international students. But there are a lot of details about the visa status and the SEVIS, and I was going to ask you to maybe explain that terminology a little bit, because there's the student visas, F1, J1, or international visitor, faculty visitor visas. But then there's also a SEVIS status, which is the student exchange visitor information system. So can you explain those terms a little bit before we dive into the details?
Sure. SEVIS is the database that universities, that the State Department, the Department of Homeland Security, their branches of ICE and U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services as well as Customs and Border Patrol, all can access information in that system. And we're required each semester to certify that a student, every F1 student, is maintaining at least the enrollment requirements imposed on them by the regulations. Um, so that record can be terminated for violations of immigration. In fact, schools are required to terminate those students' records at under certain circumstances. However, terminating the status in SEVIS isn't the same thing, or terminating the record in SEVIS isn't exactly the same thing as a termination of their immigration status. Only an immigration judge or an adjudicator can do that. What happened over the last many weeks was hundreds, at least, we don't know the exact number, of students had their SEVIS records terminated, which in effect, for those who were authorized for employment, uh, effectively ended their employment authorization. Uh, but there was no determination that they had violated their immigration status. So SEVIS, even though it's not the same thing as status, it has the same effect as a violation of status. Once that record's terminated, the student is extremely limited in what they can do. It was unclear even from the court cases that went forward whether they were even legally present in the U.S. after that, after those terminations. And ultimately, the government has backed off on those terminations for the time being.
So, if a student's F1 visa is revoked, they can still continue to stay in the United States, correct?
That has always been the case, Nate. I don't know if you have
Yeah.
counterexamples, but that's been the case for years. And there were a number of times when students had their visas revoked for things like there's a list of bad actor employers who abuse students and the employment process. And if a student has reported working for one of these bad actors, they may have had their visa revoked. What that meant was that next time they left the US, their seemingly unexpired visa was no longer valid, and they had to go apply for a new visa where presumably they would have to defend whatever action that led to that visa revocation.
So if your visa is revoked, you can legally continue to stay in the United States, but if you leave the States and try to come back, you can't enter because you have no visa anymore. But
Right.
with the SEVIS status, you cannot be a student anymore, correct?
Well,
Correct.
I mean, so most universities don't have an immigration status check for enrolled students. There are undocumented people throughout the United States, people who came and overstayed visas, and there's nothing that prevents them from enrolling at most universities. So the same would be true with an international student who violated their status or otherwise had their SEVIS record terminated. We would not prevent them from continuing to study.
Mm-hmm.
And there is a process where most status violations, except unauthorized employment, where a student can explain themselves to a USCIS adjudicator and essentially get forgiveness called reinstatement. So that's typically what would happen if a student, as is not unusual, can't be full-time a particular semester. Maybe they had a delay in getting their funds released. They couldn't pay their prior term bill, and so they're not allowed to register for a semester. But then when things clear up, they can explain that to USCIS through the reinstatement process. And traditionally, those reinstatement applications are approved for students who have any kind of valid reason beyond their control for the status violation.
Then, I understand what you're saying, Jeff. Nate, let me ask this, though. The current administration, the Trump administration, its attitude towards people coming to the United States seems to me overly harsh. And let me read you what U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, when he declared a one-strike immigration policy for students and all temporary visa holders, including visitors, foreign-born professionals, and H-1B status. Here's what he said in part. Critically, the State Department has now made clear that a visa is a privilege, not a right. He also said that whenever the government catches non-US citizens breaking America's laws, it will take action to revoke their status. And he singled out international students, saying, quote, "This extends to thousands of foreign students studying in the United States who abuse our hospitality." Nate, with you, where is this coming from? And in your experience, to what extent are these international students abusing America's hospitality?
Well, so to kind of piggyback on what Jef said, I want to go back because just to add some more context from different conversations. I think one of the new things that's happened this year, right? And I'm going to get to the hospitality, the abusive hospitality issue. But there's, if your CEVA status was, if you've been terminated, if you lost your CEVA status, as Jef said, that usually means you have to depart. But there was always an appeal process, right? That you could appeal, you could apply for reinstatement. Now, one of the things that's happened this year, though, is there's been a new category of terminations. And so what I understand is that within the last 2 months, DSOs have been alerted to this new category of termination called visa cancellation / criminal records check. And if you go in as a DSO, you can terminate someone for cause, but that specific category is not available to institutions' DSOs, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that termination is coming from within the organization that houses CEVAs, and so we'd like to think, well, why aren't university officials stopping this? Well, they have very limited ability. I mean, certainly, when a cancellation comes through centrally, as what's been happening, and one newspaper reported 5,000 cancellations across the United States for this category of reason. There's no recourse other than to communicate well with the student, really, about what's going on. But the idea that the visa is no longer a right and it's a privilege. Everyone's been on notice about this since at least 1945, I think. Post World War II, there has always been a process for vetting individuals, for applying for visas, for showing sufficient financial support and prior academic preparation to actually complete the degree program that you've proposed. And the F1 student visa program has been one of the biggest success stories immigration-wise in U.S. history. I mean, you think about all of the people like Elon Musk, for instance, who have come here essentially to study and work, and we've attracted the best and brightest. And so the idea that international students are somehow abusing our generosity, we've really been able to skim actually the best minds from across the world in a way that no other country has. And I think that, the risk here that we run is that we somehow lose that appeal. And because certainly, and I'm talking with international students, and I'm still connected with them. I had one of my former students told me the other day that someone currently enrolled in Ohio University is thinking about a master's program in Germany because he just thinks the job opportunities, the professional opportunities will be better now. And so we really have to be on guard with this.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
I really want to echo and emphasize that international students have, on the whole, been one of our greatest strengths.
Mm-hmm.
They've contributed immeasurably to our economic development and to our political soft power, developing great relationships around the world with people who want to do business with the U.S. And sending the message that they're somehow scheming or scamming us when in fact they're bringing untold millions into the U.S. economy and contributing to the economic growth and development, it really is scapegoating. And the student visa in particular The reason we have CVIS, the reason why we know so much, the reason why the government was even able to revoke visas is because they they being the really Congress implemented this requirement that international students be tracked. Now, why track international students and not tourists or H-1B holders? The reason is because the government can get someone else to do all the work, the schools that enroll the students.
Okay.
There's no centralized, no group that they can force the tens of thousands of H-1B employers to, track things the way that they can force the 3,000 colleges and universities to do.
And I also heard that the recent visa revocations happened for about 1,500 students.
I've heard everything from high hundreds to, as Bertram mentioned, 5,000.
Right.
The truth is nobody outside the government knows because nobody else can access that kind of information.
Right. And I think people don't really understand that when international students come here to study at a US university, they have to pay out-of-state tuition. And a lot of people can't afford this in other countries because of the exchange rate, because dollar is more valuable than their money. So a majority of the time, those international students are supported by their governments with a scholarship because they are some of the brightest, most intelligent students, and they were able to get those government scholarships to come and study in the United States. And so, in a way, this is something that every country complains about, the brain drain that is caused by international students, like the students going into the United States universities.
There certainly is an ethical argument to be made that by recruiting international students, what we're doing is having some of the poorest countries in the world subsidize our education because those countries have nurtured and educated those students for, maybe up through their bachelor's degree, and where higher education is heavily subsidized. And so those are the best and brightest students from all over the world. And then we take them, we finish them off with a master's degree and recruit them into our economy. So in effect, poor countries are subsidizing the U.S. education system.
Now, the both of you have worked very closely with international students, which in and of itself is a wonderful thing to hear, because I don't know what I know. Taji and I have both had the same experience on our college campuses that we attended, where the administrations were very, very willing to work with international students to help out. I know personally when a dictator took over the country I was originally from, and I was rendered stateless. In fact, the president of the university reached out to me after he had heard what was going on, invited me into his office and said, "Hey, listen, anything we can do, we'll help you out. If you want to stay on, if there's trouble with the financing, we'll work with you on that," which was very encouraging. And that was what I was hearing from international students last year. In fact, at YSU, which that largest student population growth was among international students, I was speaking to one from India, and he was telling me how he was texting all his relatives and friends to come to YSU because it was cheaper, it was great, they loved Youngstown, they loved the area and all of that. Yesterday, I was speaking to some of the international students who have been open with me in the past, who was so afraid to say anything. They wouldn't even let me know whether or not the semester was over. And I started laughing and I said, "What's going on?" They said, "We don't know what we're allowed to say." And it's really a disturbing thing. But there is a growing sentiment in this country, especially among Donald Trump supporters, that America should not be admitting so many international students because they're taking away college and university slots from native-born Americans. Are they right? And both of you, do you believe that this country benefits from having international students on college campuses? Jef, go ahead.
Yeah, the idea that they're taking away slots is, especially in northeastern Ohio, where our population decline means that there are fewer students, local students coming to college. It's absurd. Now, international students are disproportionately represented among the enrolled students in, for example, STEM fields like
Right.
engineering. And that's not because they're displacing U.S. students. It's because U.S. students have not, in sufficient numbers, pursued the kind of mathematically oriented education that prepares them to be engineers and don't have the interest in doing that. And so the reality is, if we want to train engineers for the future of our economy, we have to look outside the U.S. born population. And so international students, again, immeasurably contribute to the U.S.
Nate?
Yeah. I mean, I'm going to echo what Jeff said. Of course, it's laughable. I mean, you look at, we're in the middle of a population decline. We've hit the enrollment cliff. We're not going to see the enrollment at the end of that enrollment cliff for another several years. And so, uh, on the flip side, I would say that international enrollments have helped administrations, higher education administrations maintain stability, financial stability, maintain, their commitment to being good stewards of state resources. And so, that it's absolutely false that certainly in Northeast Ohio, that international students are taking spots away from, American students at all. And I would say, in addition to STEM field, one of the big success stories has been medical education and how many international students have gone on to become doctors. I think almost every single one of my physicians for the last 20 years has come here as an F1 student. We have I won't say a doctor shortage, but certainly when you compare us to other developed countries, we don't have the number of doctors per capita. And so, again, if you take international students out of that equation, I want to bring up one other point, Bertram, though. And this is very interesting in how the federal government classifies the revenue that is produced by international students. They actually classify it as an export. And don't ask me why, but for reporting purposes, it's classified as an American export, a U.S. export. So you think about the overall goal of the Trump administration to
Right.
balance trade. Okay, this is actually this will at some point, if international students start to depart the United States, it will show up in the numbers in a bad way, and make it much that more difficult to actually achieve trade parity. Um,
Yeah. It's the fifth largest service export in the U.S. economy. And of course, the U.S. economy, our exports are about 70% services as opposed to manufactured goods. So the emphasis to the exclusion of services on manufacturing trade, balances, really just undermines the true story of our economic integration around the world, that the U.S. provides insurance services, banking services, all kinds of services to the rest of the world, and, and has a trade surplus with most countries when you include services in the accounting.
Yeah, I had a friend in Turkey who is an engineer as well, and he contacted me recently. His son has been accepted to a couple US universities, and he was asking me what he should do, especially, when the visa revocations were happening, because he didn't want to send his child to a place where there's so much uncertainty. And of course, they're also going to pay a lot of money for their child's education. And I mean, everybody's children is precious to them. They don't want them to be in panic or in a, in a situation where they don't know what to do, or they are told to leave the country or they get deported for some reason. So he was asking my advice, and I really didn't know what to say. I mean, I asked him if his son got accepted to any universities in Europe, and maybe at least for the next 4 years, he should probably pursue those other universities because it's a risk. So I was wondering what you would say to those parents.
I'm hopeful that this administration will see it, as every administration, both Republican and Democratic, have seen for the last 50 years, that international students are a treasure of our country that we need to value and encourage international students to enroll. That this administration, I think, in their zeal to target undocumented immigrants and finding that hard, turn to the easy prey, the international students who are monitored very closely by SEVIS. And I'm hopeful that they will realize the damage that can be done. The latest numbers I saw is there's a 45% decline in interest in coming to the U.S. It won't take very long for not just the universities to feel that, but the communities. Higher education has also been a target of the Trump administration, as I'm sure you are well aware. And higher education institutions are the engines of economic development in their regions. Even small state universities like YSU, where would employers find workers with the knowledge and skills they need if the local universities weren't there turning them out, both domestic students and international students?
But and I'm going to be political here. Republicans both in Columbus and in Washington have demonized higher education to the point where even overseas, people are beginning to wonder about what's going on in America on our college campuses. When the administration attacks Harvard, which is the gold standard, and all of a sudden talks about it in terms of sort of making it the enemy, people actually do worry. And so, Nate, let me ask this. The presidents of universities and colleges, including President Johnson at YSU, insist that they were not notified when ICE invaded the campuses to round up students. And indeed, they are saying, these presidents say that they have not been given any official reasons for why these students were nabbed. And interestingly, and perhaps it's just the way I read things, there has seemed to be very muted criticism of Donald Trump and the administration and ICE from these presidents. So what does that tell you, Nate, about what's going on college campuses today?
I think despite, however, a board or a administration or a president, despite whatever their political alliances may lean, I think they would be solidly together and in line with the idea that you don't really want to draw the ire of the current, administrative tendency to, as they've done with Harvard, to really kind of hold either grant funding hostage. And we saw that with Ohio State, who made certain changes to their structure in order to safeguard, their financial revenues and support. And I tend to believe, you mentioned that, President Johnson indicated he had no prior knowledge. I tend to believe this because all the presidents are saying the same thing across the United States. Certainly, if there were, some sort of a conspiracy, that would get out. That would get out. But all the presidents are essentially saying the same thing. All the administrators saying the same thing. We had no prior indication, and I think that's probably correct because what would be the point? I mean, there would be a limited reason for informing administrators beforehand, and there's limited pushback that administrations can give to this sort of thing.
Now, if ICE were to come onto our campuses, we would expect them to give notice, but we haven't seen that on our campuses.
Well, there's a photograph that was posted on the internet of a ICE van parked outside YSU's business school, I think it was.
So we had one on our campus too, and it turned out to have been a canine training exercise.
Oh, is that right?
Yes. So
Okay.
as far as I know, they've not come targeting our students. And our campus police chiefs have a liaison they work with at ICE. If they ever do need to come onto campus, they would give notice, and we would, under the law, be forced to, be in compliance by cooperating.
Right. The last story I saw about Ohio was that at least 50 international students studying in Ohio's colleges and universities had been targeted and their visas had been revoked. They also suggest that the number of international students who have been kicked out of the country could be higher because some schools have not revealed the exact numbers. And this was according to Cleveland.com. Youngstown State University had 14, I think, that were students that were targeted. Do you have any information about these students, why they were on the radar for ICE and the federal government? Either of you?
I would just say, the discussion amongst the students is that there's a great amount of confusion about why this has happened to specific people. As far as the students have said, and of course that's one source of information. There's always a different story, perhaps. Is that there were no immigration violations. They'd never fallen out of status, either intentionally or otherwise. They'd never committed crimes. Certainly, I've been involved in cases in the past where people have been deported, and it was always very clear in the past in my career to draw the line between why someone was being deported and their deportation, their actual deportation. It was usually a very clear case of criminality involved, but that was not a factor, at least to the Youngstown State students' minds.
I mean, my colleagues around the state and I share information, and it seemed that all or nearly all of the students had some, I would say, interaction with police. So it could have been a speeding ticket. It could have been even a parking ticket in some cases,
Right.
but their names appeared in some criminal database. I know that some students had charges brought against them, but those charges were dismissed because they hadn't actually done anything. And they were targeted by these visa revocations. So there seems to have been some kind of perhaps AI attempt to match everyone who had an arrest or a citation of any kind. I mean, one student had been charged with underage drinking on a college campus. Imagine. The charges had been dropped, but they were targeted.
And of course, charges do not a criminal make, and a speeding ticket does not indicate a moral failure.
Right.
I want to remind that in 2020, I believe this was the last year of the first Trump administration, there was a lot of talk about deporting international students as well. But that has not been done during his first term. In the second term, I want to know if there is any law or regulation that has changed. Like, is there anything that is different from before that targets students with traffic violations, for example? Or is this like an increase in enforcement of existing rules, or is it just a political attempt or a policy shift?
Nate, I'll let you take that.
Yeah, I mean, there's been no substantive change in regulations that I'm aware of. I think that what we've seen is sort of a classic, military, kind of a probing maneuver. And so, clearly that there's an interest in trying to get not native-born citizens home or outside of the United States. And we've seen that with various visa statuses or a lack of visa statuses. And so this was one, as Jef had kind of indicated, might have been low-hanging fruit. Let's see what happens. This was, these people's visas were rescinded. These students' visas were rescinded, 6 weeks, 2 months ago. When those were challenged in court, the administration had lost many of those cases, and they quickly rescinded all of them, as far as I know. And so I think this was a probe to see how it was going to go. It was a finger in the wind, and they quickly backed off, and they said, we're likely to lose the rest of these if we proceed in this way, and it's going to tie up, X number of resources to no effect.
And in that regard, I have a question for both of you, but let me read to you the headline from this latest Associated Press story that puts this issue in perspective. The headline reads, "International students in the U.S. skip travel amid visa crackdown." You know, a lot of students in the past would go home or travel or go with friends and all of that. And because of the fear of what's going on, they're staying close to home. And for both of you, given your involvement and knowledge of international students, what advice would you give them today to avoid being targeted by ICE? Nate, go ahead, and then Jef.
Well, I mean, so the DSOs that I know that are currently working are more cautious on travel, because certainly at the border that presents an opportunity, for a sort of a negative immigration outcome that doesn't exist if you're just, in Kent or in Youngstown attending classes. And so, particularly as it relates to visa renewals. And so if you have a student here on an expired visa, you have to go home to Vietnam or wherever it is, and they're going to have to reapply for that visa. I would say, you're only a year from graduating. Why not just stay here this summer? All right. Finish out. That would be my own sense of personal advice. That's what if it were my son or daughter, that's what I'd give them. The advice I'd give them is my child. And certainly if they were my advisees, an immigration advisor, that's the advice I would give them. The other thing too, that the ripple effect that we haven't talked about, and I'm interested to see what Jef thinks about this. I think that it's going to be more difficult for people to even secure visa interviews with the cuts that Rubio is talking about in the State Department. And so you may not have a sea change in terms of, an order going down from the top to tell visa officers, okay, you have a rejection quota. But they, with layoffs, they may simply not have the capacity to evaluate and interview and grant anywhere near the number of visas that they've had over the last decade.
They did update their wait times. I think it was April 27th. They published an update. Visa applications that require an interview are typically first-time student visas or applicants for a visa for a new program, and they generally waive the interview for students who are renewing a visa because they're returning to continue the same program. So those wait times in some places are many, many months. So if effectively, there's no chance of a newly admitted student getting here for fall semester. But in many places, they're still 1.5 to 2 months. So there are students who should still be able to come. But we saw visa declines even before the new administration came in. We saw just an overwhelming increase in demand, particularly from India. And they didn't have the capacity before to interview every applicant that they wanted a visa. So the other, Bertram, just for your question about travel,
Right.
because we have been very forthcoming that we recommend our students avoid unnecessary travel abroad, particularly students who are on the list of whose countries are on the list of potential travel bans, because if those are put into place, we would expect that they would be put into place with little or no notice, and students could easily find themselves just barred from coming back.
Yeah.
So and that list is bigger than in 2017.
One of the reasons for what's going on college campuses and the Trump administration's crackdown is the issue of Gaza and the Palestinians and all of the demonstrations. And this idea of increased anti-Semitism against Jewish students on campuses, etc. And I'm aging myself when I talk about me. When I first came to the States, and I met with the deputy ambassador as I was getting my visa, who encouraged me to come to the States, and because I was going to study journalism, and said, you're going to be able to speak freely and openly on college campuses, and you're going to be able to, find out what freedom of the press really means, because you're going to be studying journalism and all of that. That has all changed. And so would you advise international students to avoid joining protests, to avoid any kind of controversial, issues or speaking out on controversial issues in order to preserve their visa status as students?
I don't think they need us to caution them on that. I think our students have gotten that message loudly and clearly through media coverage of several high-profile individuals who were targeted for deportation solely on the basis of their political expressions. So,
And how do you personally feel when you see this kind of gagging of students on campus?
well, Kent State University has a proud tradition of student protest, and it really strikes in the heart of our identity to have to tone those down. But our U.S. students are continuing their protesting traditions, and I think our international students, they're afraid to say very much about anything, and they're not going to go out and risk being identified as a protester on really any political issue. They're not here for politics for the most part. They're here to pursue an education.
Nate?
The First Amendment applies to anyone, I think, on American soil, unless, you're a part of a certain category like a prisoner, in which case some of your freedoms may be restricted. But, I agree with Jef. That message has been loud and clear. Should it be that way, if that's the question?
Yeah.
No, I support the First Amendment. I
Yeah,
think that there should be more freedom of speech, not less.
Right.
And so certainly, if you look at this historically, you think about the hundreds of thousands of Saudi students who came and enrolled in the United States over the 90s and 2000s, and they were here and they saw how a healthy democracy worked. They experienced freedoms. Females were able to drive. They saw their American friends being able to vote despite their gender. And, a few years ago, we saw the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia allow women to drive. We saw them give some political voice to females. And so, by our example, this has been a very powerful way that we've even changed the world. Other countries, and in a very positive way. So, I don't think we want to retreat from our basic constitutional values of freedom of speech.
And the idea that someone who objects to Israel's conduct in a war is, the equating that kind of expression with anti-Semitism is, it's just patently ridiculous. There are many thousands of observant Jews who are objecting to Israel's conduct. The International Court of Human Rights has objected to it.
Right.
And that doesn't mean that it's anti-Semitic. It just, criticizing somebody's conduct is not the same thing as criticizing their right to exist.
I think you saw, like last week, Charlie Kirk himself even cautioned. He said, we have to stop using anti-Semitism and painting everyone who disagrees with the foreign policy of Israel with a broad brush, or we're likely to actually increase anti-Semitism.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly.
Right. Especially considering Palestinians are actually Semitic people as well.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
So, one of the things that I valued the most about the United States was the freedom of speech, and that it is the First Amendment in the Constitution. And, many times my family wanted me to go back to Turkey and to move back. And I always said, I don't want to worry about what I post on Twitter or social media, criticizing the government and something happens to me or I get fined, And so now I have a friend from Turkey who is sending her two daughters to a boarding school in Atlanta. And she received an email from the school administration urging her to tell her children not to post anything controversial on social media. And she was kind of shocked that this happened in the US now, because I don't think in Turkey a school administration would send an email to the parents and tell them not to post anything political on social media. And I mean, this is not that the kids were posting anything. It was just um, a cautionary email, I guess. But I mean, this is happening now in the United States, and it really makes me very sad.
And that's where we have seen across the country international students affected by their political views is posting opinions or even liking someone else's post or following someone who makes posts that the administration has found objectionable. And again, this is a big part of the caution about travel. That's when those social media accounts can be most likely to be, they're most likely to be scrutinized when a student tries to come back in.
And final question from me, Todd, you might have others. The idea that college campuses are cauldrons of liberal brainwashing and wokeism, and that DEI programs have undermined higher education in America. Both of you, with your vast, long experience in higher education, how does that make you feel when you hear that? And Nate, if you want to go first, and then Jeff.
The way I see the most recent run of regulations coming out of both the state and the United States federal government is that it's actually not an attack on higher education for higher education's sake itself. It's more of an attack on critical thinking and free inquiry. And so knowledge discovery is the business of professors. It's the business of higher education, and knowledge discovery happens without walls. You can't say, okay, we want you to find a cure for this, but don't look into these areas, or don't test this in these populations. We're not interested in helping these people. And so I think that the principle of free inquiry is what's under attack. So yeah, hugely concerning. I'm hopeful. I mean, if you look at the long arc of history, it bends towards justice. And it's history that teaches us to hope that things will swing around in terms of a pendulum. But certainly, yeah, the current moment's very concerning.
Yeah, and I think it stems from the perception and perhaps reality that the more educated a person is, the more likely they are to embrace progressive or left of center views. And their conclusion is, well, there must be some kind of indoctrinating going on in our universities. And there doesn't seem to be a willingness to accept that as people intellectually develop their critical thinking, they're more likely to conclude that certain right-wing agenda items are counterproductive to a free and safe society. And I've yet to have anyone on this anti-DEI crusade explain to me which of those three principles they are against. Are they against diversity? Are they against equity?
Exactly.
Or are they against inclusion? Because all three of those seem like valuable, goals for us to me.
Go ahead, Taji.
I was wondering if you had any statistics about what kind of students were targeted in those last few weeks with the visa revocations. I mean, are they mostly undergrads, grads, certain nationalities?
There haven't been any patterns that I've been made aware of. As I said, that several of us who work at larger state universities, we consult with one another and share information informally, and we couldn't find patterns The students at my university who were targeted were both grad and undergrad. They were both enrolled in post-completion. There were more from some countries than others, but those countries have more students from that country than other countries. So it wasn't possible to pick up a pattern.
Right. Um, and finally, I just want to mention that at least from Turkey, the students who are coming here to study, I know that there's a decline among many of the parents I know, um, and people are sending their kids to Europe mostly, or maybe Canada, but not as many to the United States. Um, and I mean, this started maybe in 2018 and it continued a little bit. Have you seen that trend overall in international student enrollments in the US? Or
I
are you
think
seeing any now?
so. It'll be very interesting to watch the monthly numbers published by the State Department about visa approvals. So the State Department publishes these once a month. Um, a lot of the visas that are being granted right now, that was already baked in. Sometimes people don't know. International students, they have a plan that really starts 2 years in advance of them ever,
Mhm.
setting their foot on these shores. And so I think where we're going to see any potential movement is really in the fall, and particularly later in the fall, once the visa season ramps up. If we look at October, November's numbers this year, I think that's going to perhaps tell a story, and hopefully the story is that there's renewed interest. But we have to be prepared, I think, for a contraction based on really this unpredictable environment we're in.
Mhm. And remember that we've seen really impressive recent gains that are in at least significant part a result of pent-up demand through the pandemic. So students had postponed their plans and came in the last two fall intakes. And so we're expecting a kind of leveling or dropping anyway as those students come in. So we won't see this effect for um, until at least fall.
Okay. Um, do you have any other questions, Bertram?
This has been very informative. Thank you to both of you, not only for you know giving us important perspective, but also for talking in terms of what hopefully our viewers will understand, which is the role that international students play, not only on college campuses but also in the country, and sort of the idea that somehow or the other they should be demonized it needs to be addressed. And I think what we've done here today will go a long way towards that. And again, thank you both. Thanks, Joe.
Thank you so
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I just
Go
want to
ahead.
say that international students will hopefully continue to come just because our universities are still some of the best in the world. And our educational philosophy, particularly at the undergraduate level, of educating a whole person and not just a skill set, and providing a 24/7 collegiate environment where not just the international office, but all of my colleagues across my campus care about our international students and see them as a integral member of our community and really support them. And I think that's what will keep our students coming.
Great.
I mean, just before we close, I do want to mention a lot of international students also supported Trump because before he became president again, the second term, he did mention that he was going to automatically grant green cards to a lot of those international students who study in US universities. And he didn't want those brains to go back to their countries and to serve the United States. So I know that, they were pretty encouraged by that at the beginning. So I'm just hoping that, things will change soon
Yeah.
and it will be a better environment for international students. So thank you so much again.
All right. Thank you for having us.